Howdy, howdy.
Hello, hello. How are you doing?
Howdy. I'm glad to come around here.
Wonderful. All right. Well, you wanted to talk about planned market versus market economies, right?
I want to focus mainly on the economic calculation problem itself. I
Hmm.
have my criticisms of mainly centralized planned economies,
Hmm.
but the economic calculation problem is terrible.
Hmm.
First off, I think right off the bat, the way that Mises portrayed uh, the initial situation in economic calculation in socialist commonwealth
Hmm.
is basically if I remember correctly, you have like I may be misremembering, but you basically have to get goods from one place to another place, and there's like a mountain in between.
Hmm.
And you can either build through the mountain or you can go around the mountain. And the thing is that as far as I'm able to understand when it comes to economic calculation problem, you first have to like ignore any other possible way to calculate like anything aside from markets, which fits for the Austrian schools since they rejected using any kind of proof uh, for uh, for their economic conjectures.
Hmm.
And along with this as well, there's already been like God knows how many like maybe at the very least like 5 solutions, definitely more, but at the very least 5 solutions to the economic calculation problem that basically figure this out. The one I'm most familiar with is participatory economics. There's some other stuff from Lange, I believe. I may be misremembering, but
Hmm.
that's as far as I'm able to understand. Paul Cockshot has recommended, I think, like some kind of cyber communism, this type of thinking. And of course, there's like the usual, like, well, there's technology. We could probably plan better to do that. But just in general, the economic calculation problem within itself is like already just flawed simply because of the fact that they ignore basically anything else. And they don't really make an effort to really prove anything, which is kind of inherent for the Austrian school.
Hmm. Okay. So I'm gonna go over some of the few things you mentioned here. So number one, I 100% agree with you in a lot of the criticisms you made of Austrian economics, particularly their lack of proofs or empirics to back up their claims. One of the things I mentioned when I went through the Wikipedia thing on the economic calculation problem was that I did very much disagree with the characterization of both market economies and of like planned economies, although that wasn't really talked about a lot more in the Wikipedia page specifically. They mostly talked about the characterization of market economies, and here they basically ignore things like market failures and adverse incentives and other issues that could be solved to some extent with like regulation or stuff like that, and also like advertising. These are all things that were ignored in their characterization of market economies, and as such it's a pretty good criticism there. However, like the thing I'm most interested in talking about is that, so ceteris paribus, assuming like everything else is the same within an economy, right? Between two different nations, given that one of the nations were using a market system to allocate resources and the other one was using a command economy to allocate resources, which one of these do you think would allocate resources most efficiently, and why do you think so? Because there is where I
Uh,
kind of like when it comes to constructing this in my head, like a model, like a logical model, it seems to me that market economies, then assuming just general economic production, not during crises, and given the level of understanding I have right now of the technology behind market planned economies, I feel that the market economies would perform better when it comes to effectively allocating resources there.
well, the thing is that we have to note for central planning, especially, there's God knows how many systems of central planning. You have what Lenin did, you have what Stalin did, you have what Mao did, you have what Hoxha did. There's like God knows how many varieties of central planning
Hmm.
that may have some slight differentiations here and there. But either way, they're different forms. Markets in themselves are simple enough. The only thing that really differentiates different types of market systems is how much the market is regulated.
Hmm.
So it's a bit of a misnomer to say whether it's market or central planning, because central planning within itself is a bit of a vague term. You have to figure out what the systems are specifically, which, as I've mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
there's the systems that come into place. But even then, I have my criticisms I've mentioned before of both markets and central planning. Markets within themselves just kind of like overestimate the prices of goods that have greater social benefit rather than um, raising the prices of goods that have a more negative social benefit. And central planning within itself is like pretty much authoritarian. Does like random self management evaluation and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But I think generally speaking, if we're like to say
I mean, I
whether or
assume
not,
like the best possible, or like a good version of markets that both of you and I would agree with should be a pretty like heavily regulated market, and
right,
your given preferable alternative of a command economy, which I think you said was participatory economics. These two
it's not a
systems, and
command economy. I just like to mention it's not
Mhm.
command economy. It's a decentrally planned economy.
Okay,
But
so it's still planned
aside from
economy,
that,
but command economy is top
yeah,
down, and planned economy could be top down or bottom up.
right,
All right,
right.
perfect. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, fine. Planned economy, your ideal version of like a planned economy versus like an idealized version of a market economy. Ceteris paribus, assuming all else is the same, why do you think that the planned economy would perform better, and why do you think that the economic calculation problem is invalid?
I think mainly speaking, as I've mentioned before, the economic calculation problem just kind of like relies too much on markets. It relies on the fact that like markets are good, planning bad. That's it. I and when it comes to why I prefer like a planned economy over a market,
Mm-hmm.
for me it's that markets within themselves have an inherent bias, as I've mentioned earlier, against products that have a good social like benefit and
Against
whatnot.
merit products.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
like if you have like oil, those if you have like oil or gas, those will be priced lower than like some kind of like ethical version of like muffins or something like that kind of general idea, right? I and
Do you think that's by virtue of them being merit or demerit goods though, or do you think that has to do with like other aspects related to the product? So if we talk about, for example, like coal and oil, do you think that the prices are so low because they're bad for the environment, or
no,
because they're
no, it's
cheap
not
products to
that.
use?
It's not because they're bad for the. It's not the price is not inherent
Apex on Anarchy
to
just
the
wanted to
thing
say keep
itself.
up the
It's
good
just
work.
that it I guess more accurately, markets misestimate the social costs of products
Oh yeah,
that
100%. It just doesn't adjust for like for externalities. 100%.
right.
A unregulated economy just doesn't do that. Yeah, 100%. But if I lay out a version of, I'm going to lay out a version of the economic calculation program and like an argument in favor of it. So if you think about it this way, okay, given that you have two economies, you have two, populations, and what do we know about populations? We know that there are demands that need to be met for the given population. We know that the demand is not just constant throughout any really given period of time. There are a massive amount of things that shift demand. Things like everything from like long-term needs, like let's say an economy is transitioning towards using more like electric cars or whatever, to everything from short-term things to like trends within clothing, encouraging people to buy certain types of types of clothing because they're trendy or whatever. The demand for products shifts greatly throughout any given time basis, really. And under a market economy, it's really volatile, right? So let's say there is a rise. A lot of people just, really, there seems to be an indication of demand through price signals. People are willing to pay more for, let's say, ripped jeans, for example. What the market can do then is because they recognize that, hey, there are so many people buying ripped jeans that people are willing to buy them at higher products. We can go create more products here and meet that excess demand and produce products for them so that we reach another market equilibrium and that we allocate our resources most efficiently. Now, should that happen under a planned economy, there isn't a price signal. You don't notice how people are willing to pay more for this product, or there are a bunch of more, at least per my understanding of planned economies right now. And there isn't a bunch of people buying this product. There isn't people buying it at a higher price than usual. And as such, because there's a lack of the price signal, you aren't really able to send the same types of messages to producers telling them what to produce and how much to produce. And in that environment, it seems to me that markets are more efficient at doing that, at producing resources that meets the needs of the population than what planned economies are, just because markets are more volatile and are more versatile.
Yeah, I think if we were to like consider like planned economies as like more centrally planned, like if we're talking about stereotypical centrally command economy, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
then a case could be made for that. But I think like for example, what participatory economic does, if you don't mind me sliding this in, uh,
Mm-hmm.
is um is that first it lets people basically it's like a glorified grocery list. You have people write out everything that they may need for next year. They don't have to be too specific. They don't have to be too generic. Just enough to where we understand what everyone is saying. Then once we have this, you have like work. You have like workplaces giving like, hey, I'm going to make this, and I'm going to make this much of that, and then I need this much in order to make that. And then just to skip over everything, I'll explain it in further detail at some point. But you aggregate all of this, you like figure out like along with social costs and benefits of everything, you figure out indicators that seem similar to prices, but it's a bit wish-washy here and there. Uh, and then you make like five like whatever final plans, and we all vote for it. And then once you get done with that, you let people actually get the stuff, but we also have to allow for like people that may not need this thing, or they realize that they may need that thing. And so by this point you'd have like um by that point you'd charge people on what they actually consume rather than what they wrote on their list. However, I imagine a similar type of solution can be made without having to sound like a market whenever I try to explain it. And with this, it kind of solves like I guess like main problems that I feel like you notice, because by the planning process we managed to like cut out most of the competitive problems and most of the whatever problems with
Mm-hmm.
markets, while also allowing for the flexibility of markets by letting people actually go out and get what they need by that
Mm-hmm.
point. So that's my general answer. And I
So,
said this before, and
mm-hmm.
I'll say it again. The economic calculation problem just kind of relies too much on the market as like an overall like value of humanity. That's as far as I'm able to understand.
Okay, so a few things I can, like, I guess pick at a bit when it comes to the grocery list thing. Once again, I would probably need to like read like a more substantive, like proposal for the small, because of course you can't be, I suppose if you were to go into all of the intricacies of your model, you probably have to
Yeah,
need, like
yeah,
3 hours, I guess, to dispose this.
Yeah, we'd be here for hours here.
Yeah, exactly.
I,
So
yeah,
some of the yeah,
it
go for
is a
it.
simplification, but that's the general idea.
All right. Yeah, so a few things I can just notice right off the bat that I guess or would like be inquiries that I had is things like, for example, the grocery list. This would be very dependent on, number one, it's very heavily reliant on a form of like overreaching logistical like system of some sort that is able to process all of these grocery lists from the entirety of the population and put them together into a coherent list and send them off to all the relevant departments and have them processed and have them produced in that sense. I mean,
Yeah,
we can see right
yeah.
now things like, for example, like during elections, which would be a fairly comparable situation, but a lot more, complicated, because with elections, you sort of you write down a person, it gets sent in, it gets counted, gets gets sent to like one institution, sort of counts the votes, bang, there you go, they make the decision through that way. But through grocery list, it's like a list of multiple things and quantities and amounts. There's a bigger time investment on the side of the person making the grocery list. It has to be processed and sent out and aggregated and sent out to all these different departments. It seems like a very heavy logistical task. And we see right now that a bunch of different nations like still have troubles when it comes to like effective logistical planning of like elections, and these things can take like days or even weeks to fully count. So that's one of the things that like the grocery list is kind of worse than the market, because market is just, it kind of like price signals are very efficient in that way.
I admit I managed to somehow leave this out, but when it comes to like the aggregation of all of like the grocery lists, I guess we're calling them by this point, is there's a institution called the Iteration Facilitation Board. This kind of acts like the pseudo market for participatory economics. They get all of the grocery lists and then they like aggregate it all into like prices and whatnot, along with the the workplaces requests, and then they help like make like 5 or 3 or whatever final plans. And just in case there's any worry of bureaucracy around here, these people don't make any like major decisions. They don't like decide whether to inflate one price or the other, and they don't decide for everyone which plan everyone's gonna follow. So just clarification.
Yeah, and then that's what I meant, how like to go into really like the nitty gritty and adjust all these like logistical things, you would need like hours upon hours of like conversation, discussion, and research and stuff like that. But those are like that's
I'd
one
like
of
to
the
mention I like to mention I'd be glad to talk about participatory economics at like a later point. We could talk about it more in depth and talk about like the benefits and wherever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, probably. We will have time for. I'll say I'll probably need a whole stream for that. I have a bunch of other stuff planned, so I need to get to that. And yeah, and what I was going to build off
Don't
of
worry,
that,
I'll
off like
let you study.
wonderful, off of
I'll let
the
you study for your stream.
the logistical issues, like things like, for example, like how frequently you were to make people do these grocery lists and stuff like that, and like planning of like large political events or large trends that may occur like right before one of these grocery lists or right after. It just seems really complicated and seems a lot more just there's more things that can go wrong than like just like a price signal.
The planning process goes through multiple rounds, mainly to like help like make sure that like there's like nobody's like asking for more than they need. Nobody's asking for all that nonsense. It goes through multiple rounds, and then once everyone agrees on a basic like plan after those rounds, you have the IFB like making the variations of the final plan.
Yeah, but do you see now where I'm coming from? How there are all these caveats, and there's all these different like large structures, which like the more different moving parts you have in a producing in a what's it called, a production sequence, the more things can go wrong and the less efficient things typically get. So that's sort of the argument that's being laid forth by this economic calculation problem, right? It's saying that for a planned economy to operate as efficiently as a market economy, like it's harder to make that happen. And as such, on an aggregate, it seems that it's more likely for planned economies to be less efficient than what market economies are. And that's, and even if you don't concede to this, the things you mentioned before, how this is so heavily reliant on what type of planned economy we're talking about, means that it already like directly applies to a whole load of different, planned economies, more command type economies, I would assume you would say. And as such, the issue you would have in the economic calculation problem isn't necessarily that the argument is bad, but more so that you believe it doesn't apply to your model of a planned economy. And those are two pretty different things.
No, it's not that. On the topic of like whether participatory economics, for example, is more efficient or less efficient than markets, there's already like a political economy, participatory economics. It already goes into depth about the proof that they use in order to like figure out whether or not Paracon is better than markets or central planning. And I like to mention here because it feels like it gets into more of like a it's complex thing, which I feel like I should probably add. Just because something is complex doesn't necessarily mean that it's like terrible. Of course, it's complex. You
Mm-hmm.
have to make sure everything's moving in right parts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's more undesirable than a market system, which just has like you buy, I sell, or something like that.
Yeah,
It
that was
I
not
just like to
quite
mention that.
the argument I was making. I was saying I wasn't saying that just because something is complex it's inherently bad. I'm just saying that on an aggregate, it may seem or it may play out that a more complex system, a more multi-partied production process is likely to be less efficient than what a market and what price signals are as an aggregate. Now, of course, when you're talking about a specific model, and you're able to weigh the examples of a market price signal model versus whichever planned economy you may prefer, and you look at them side by side, then that argument may be like irrelevant or whatever. But when you talk about just like as an aggregate, the more moving parts is and the more complex it is, then it's more likely that this will occur. Whereas if you're comparing two different models, you would have to say, okay, this thing's complexity is causing this inefficiency, not just, oh, it might do this, or yada 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 and stuff like that. So that's sort of like the key difference that I would believe, and why I
Well,
believe that. Just like, yeah, it's still something that would probably occur on an aggregate.
well, yeah, I'm not saying that it won't occur. Again, like if we're talking about especially central planning, I find that like if you don't have like the specific right type of like ways that like central planners can get the information that they need, of course it's inevitable that they're not going to get enough information. I'm not exactly denying that, but the thing is that with the economic calculation problem in itself is that it's just kind of too general, I guess I could say. It just focuses on planning rather than central or decentral or this specific
Mhm.
system or
Yeah, I
that
mean,
specific system.
it's like most arguments, right?
It's too
You
general.
need to understand where they apply and where they don't. I still think that the economic calculation problem is a valid argument for discussing and criticizing certain models, and for some of them it may not be a valid model. But I don't think that has to do with the validity of the argument itself. I think it just has to do with an understanding of when to properly apply them or not.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. Right.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
it
Glad we
was a
can
fun
finally
discussion.
agree after all that nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we got an agreement in the end. Yeah, thank you very much
Woo!
for calling in and discussing the economic calculation problem, giving me a
Yeah.
extra segment for my stream. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Also, hi YouTube.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do the Xanderall debate review, but before that, do you have any Twitter or whatever that you wanna drop a name for?
Uh not really. I just want to say, read For the People, By the People by Raman Hanel. Very good book. That's it. Bye.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much for calling in. All right, cool. Good discussion. Now, I think I don't know. Did I change my mind on what did I walk away with here? I walked away with an understanding of terminology, how not all planned economies are command economies. That's something I figured out, or like I got to, I suppose, how command refers to more top-down planned economies versus planned economy can refer to top-down or bottom-up decentralized planned economies. That's something I learned during this discussion. But overall, I think that the main point I was trying to prove at the beginning was that I don't think there's anything wrong with the economic calculation problem as an argument. I just think it's often misapplied. And that's, I felt like I kind of held consistent on that throughout the entire thing. But yeah,